afternoon or evening, Euro students. No matter what time of day you're listening, I'd like to welcome everybody back for another SIGcast. This episode is brought to you, a little word from our sponsors here. This episode is brought to you by none other than the KOPD. Yeah, that's right. The Keystone Oaks Police Department is our sponsor today. KOPD has been proudly serving and protecting the halls of Keystone Oaks as well as our athletic facilities for decades. Officer John Bruner and Beth Patton prevent crimes, and when they can't, they make sure justice is served. Justice is definitely served on the menu at Keystone Oaks. Thanks, kind in part, to KOPD. Speaking of justice, you know who helped bring the nobility in line with the use of the likes of the Inquisition and the Star Chamber Court? That's right, you guessed it. The new centralized monarchs that we've been talking about in AP Euro over the course of the last few lessons. We're back with the second installment of New Monarchs and the State Control of Religion. And we've already talked about Catholic monarchs and their policies towards religion, whether it's the Inquisition under Ferdinand and Isabella or the continuation of that policy under Philip II. We've also mentioned the politique style of Henry IV in France, where he sought to unify France rather than divide it any further. Yesterday, we discussed Henry VIII's Tudor policy under the Act of Supremacy and Succession of 1534, where he formed the Anglican Church with him at the top of the hierarchy. If you remember, it was really a reincarnation of sorts of the Catholic Church under the 6 Articles of Faith, and the Anglican Church kept most of the Catholic theology. Remember, Henry didn't break away for necessarily religious reasons as much as the reasons were that he wanted a divorce. However, under his son, Edward VI, England's Anglican Church underwent a facelift into a more truer Protestant direction influenced by Calvinism. But the young king died at the age of 16, with no heir. And enter Bloody Mary Tudor. Yes, Bloody Mary tried to undo all of the changes made by her half-brother and even some of the policies made by her dad. She tried to reinstate Catholicism into the realm. Well, it didn't go too well, as she earned the infamous nickname. Today we're going to pick up right where we left off and learn a little bit more about the religious policies of Elizabeth I, which will help reveal why many consider her one of the greatest monarchs in English history. So as stated earlier, Mary died at the age of 42. She is thought to have had uterine cancer or possibly ovarian cysts. Initially, when she got sick, many thought that she was pregnant. In fact, Mary was sure she was pregnant and really signed off on her distant husband, Philip, again, Philip II of Spain, would serve as regent of the child if something happened to Mary. However, it was discovered that she was not in fact pregnant, but actually dying. Kind of a sad story, obviously. Thus, the Catholic queen had to accept that her half-sister, Protestant sister, Elizabeth, would be the next monarch. So it is in Elizabeth I that we see yet another example of a monarch bringing about religious reforms that lead to greater control of their state. And this example with Elizabeth, if we remember, is Henry VIII's daughter. She was the product of his marriage with Anne Boleyn. She entered the monarchy in turbulent fashion. You see, Catholics saw her as an illegitimate child, that Henry was never legitimately divorced. And so, the whole notion of being illegitimate basically caused a lot of people to say, you know what, she's not our queen. So they rejected her legitimacy regarding the throne. Also, complicating this matter is that Elizabeth was brought up with strong Protestant views. So she really had, as she entered the monarchy or sat on the throne, had to walk a very, very careful and calculated path. And she did this. She did this in the end very effectively. She oversaw the development of Protestantism in England and the reestablishment of the new Church of England. She was another example, like Henry IV in France, of a politique, which means she was a practical politician who carefully navigated a middle ground between Anglicanism and Protestantism. She put the well-being of her subjects before her religious views. So she faced pressure from all sides, not just the Catholics, but fellow Anglicans and even Puritans who sought to reform the church even further. Her religious legacy is often known as the Elizabethan settlement. That's a term you'll definitely need to know on the AP exam. Basically, Elizabeth and Parliament required conformity, unification, conformity to the Church of England, but people were, in effect, allowed to worship Protestantism and Catholicism privately. Basically, don't ask, don't tell. The Anglican Church resembled the Lutheran Church as it existed under Elizabeth. Some church practices, including ritual, resembled Catholic practices. And we've talked about that if you grow up Lutheran and you go to a Catholic service, you realize, wow, there's not much difference here. The difference more or less is in the sacraments and some of the theology. But one of the first things she did is she reissued the Act of Supremacy, which her father had passed in 1534. And basically what this does is, just like the original, it made Elizabeth I the head of the Church of England. Remember, Mary turned it back to the Pope in her efforts to re-Catholicize England. She also issued something called the Act of Uniformity. And on paper, all of England had to church. Everyone in England had to attend a church on Sunday at an Anglican church with the Book of Common Prayer. But you have to understand, at the time, this was considered a moderate approach to religion. How so? Well, let me explain. The Book of Common Prayer was first instituted under Edward VI. As we said, Elizabeth brought it back. This book represents a compromise between old ideas of the Catholic faith and the new ideas unleashed by Protestantism. It should be noted that extreme Catholics despised it, while extremist Protestants, like the Pilgrims, also hated it. But it was a middle ground. Everything about Elizabeth was modern. She didn't worry about the fine points of theology. She was appalled by the violence and destruction caused by religious controversies, not only in England, but also throughout the rest of Europe. And she felt really an obligation to maintain peace in her realm by allowing her people to follow their consciences. So the Book of Common Prayer allowed people of different religious convictions to pray together in a national church, bringing them all together. Catholicism remained, especially among the gentry, but also could not be practiced openly. Services in the national churches were obviously given in English. She also, this doesn't have to do with the Book of Common Prayer, but she didn't also bring back the monasteries as Mary had sought to do. So another reform, the clergy was allowed to marry, and everyone, as I mentioned, was required to attend services, church services of an Anglican church. And if they didn't, they were fined. One thing we have to realize here is it wasn't as much about religion as it was about loyalty. Elizabeth was insistent on loyalty. She figured the Book of Common Prayer allowed enough wiggle room, allowed them to pray and worship together as Englishmen, regardless of what they practiced behind closed doors. She did persecute Catholics that she felt had divided loyalties, however. And it was not because of their religious beliefs, but as I said, it was more for their submission to the Pope and plots that they were involved in to have Protestant Elizabeth ousted for her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. As we noted earlier in another lesson, Mary, Queen of Scots, being involved in many plots, but one in particular involving Philip II of Spain, prior to the eve of the Spanish Armada, Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, was met with an axe. Overall, this moderate approach was pretty effective, and for a while, England enjoyed a time of peace that fostered an intellectual flowering, enter William Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and an era of international expansion, thanks to the likes of Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake. Now, there were some English societal changes under the Tudors that we may need to focus on. Capitalism begins to play a major role to a high degree of social mobility. Again, social mobility being that you could actually move up the ladder into a social class or likewise move down. Commercial revolution that we'll talk about here shortly significantly increased the size of the English middle class. This is a middle class movement. And again, when we talk about middle class, we're talking about merchants and businessmen. The agricultural revolution and its agricultural techniques and reforms improved farming and husbandry, which is the breeding of animals and crops, and allowed England to mass produce food. This in turn leads to, in England, a market revolution where people can specialize in other areas and they don't have to worry about being subsistent farmers and providing for their families. This is also going to lead to why the Industrial Revolution later on will happen in England before other places in Europe. So as I said, England possesses the largest middle class except for the Netherlands. Now there's also a class called the gentry. The gentry are wealthy landowners, not nobility, in the countryside who dominates the politics of the House of Commons, which is England's lower house in Parliament. Many people in the gentry had been successful businessmen or merchants and had moved up from the middle class into the upper class. They relied heavily on legal precedent to limit the king on economic and political issues, especially when it came to spending and taxation. Think of the Magna Carta going back to 1215. They were willing to pay taxes as long as they had a say in the affairs of England. And it's interesting because unlike France, there was no stigma to paying taxes in England. Remember, most of the nobility in France were tax exempt. Since the tax burden was more equitable in England, the peasantry was not as badly exploited as they were in France. But the issue of taxation will bring the House of Commons and the monarchy into direct conflict. Religiously, Calvinists were growing in numbers in England as compromises on Scripture, like the Book of Common Prayer, allowed the Anglican Church to lose some ground. Puritans, the most reform-minded of the Calvinists, sought to purify the Church of England by removing many of the Catholic elements. The Protestant work ethic that we have mentioned before in this class impacted many members of the middle class and the gentry. Calvinists were highly opposed to any influence by the Catholic Church, and this is going to lead to some tension as the Stuarts emerge on the throne after the Tudors die out with the death of Elizabeth. Let's talk a little bit more about these Puritans. Like the Huguenots in France, the Calvinists in the Netherlands, a group of in England, were called the Puritans, and they also used religious conflict to challenge their monarchs. The Puritans were a radical group. The most radical of them were the Pilgrims, but the Puritans were a radical group of Protestants in England that felt that the Church of England was far too similar to the Roman Catholic Church. It had very similar traditions and structure, and the Puritans felt strongly that the Anglican Church needed to be more like the Lutheran and Calvinist counterparts. They wanted to get rid of stained glass, pageantry, gold, sacraments, all of those things. And since they were so critical of the Anglican Church, they were often persecuted by the government with harsh laws, unfair treatment against their group. As we stated earlier, the Puritans felt Mary's wrath, Mary the Catholic's wrath, and many fled to the Netherlands where tolerance was the norm. Elizabeth was tolerant, but as we mentioned, expected loyalty. As the Puritans protest, some of them felt her wrath and persecution as well. So this tension will drastically increase after the death of Elizabeth with her cousins, the Catholic Stuarts from Scotland, when they take the throne and start implementing changes. They did, however, resist and continue their faith. Eventually, many of them left England due to their extensive persecution and violence for the Netherlands, and also think about APUS, but many of them went to the Americans on the Mayflower. Synthesis: if they didn't move to Americas, we wouldn't have Thanksgiving, which is coming up. While many states attempted to control religion, many groups like the Puritans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists resisted, and some took a different approach. Once the Spanish were defeated in the Netherlands in 1648, the Dutch Parliament voted for religious pluralism, or freedom, in the new nation. Rather than worrying about enforcing Calvinism or Catholicism, the Dutch simply allowed general religious freedom to maintain peace and even unity amongst Jews and Muslims. And likewise, earlier in France, with Henry of Navarre, had already allowed religious pluralism to an extent in the Kingdom of France with the Edict of Nantes, in which he stated Paris is worth a mess, and was one of the first examples of a politique, which is putting the interests of the state above personal religion. Both of these were early examples of religious pluralism to maintain peace. Please know them, love them, be them, and remember them, most importantly, on your unit test, midterm, and the AP exam. So that's it for this version of SIGCast, New Monarchs, Centralization, State Control of Religion by the Monarchs. Hope you got something out of it. See you next time.